July 12, 1944, 11:15 a.m., outside Saint-Lô, France. The air is thick with the scent of pulverized masonry and diesel exhaust. Inside the turret of a Sherman tank, Sergeant Miller wipes a bead of sweat from his eye, his hand trembling slightly on the traverse handle. He can hear the low, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of German tracks somewhere behind the next ridge. For weeks, the crews of the Third Army have been living in a state of sustained trauma. They've watched their brothers incinerated inside Shermans that the German 75mm and 88mm guns cut through like hot knives through butter. The American M4 Sherman was a masterpiece of logistics, easy to ship, easy to repair, and mass-produced by the thousands. But on the battlefield of Western Europe, it was a death trap. The standard armor was only about 2 inches thick on the front. To a German Panther or Tiger, that wasn't a defense. It was an invitation. The crews knew it. The German tankers knew it. And General George S. Patton knew it. Patton was a man who understood the psychology of the soldier better than perhaps any other commander in the Allied High Command. He knew that a soldier who believes his equipment is inferior is a soldier who hesitates. And in a tank duel, hesitation is a death sentence. But Patton was facing a wall of bureaucracy. Back in Washington, the Ordnance Department insisted that the Sherman was sufficient. They argued that adding more armor would strain the transmission, slow the tank down, and ruin the mobility that defined American doctrine. But Patton didn't give a damn about the transmission if the crew was dead. He looked at his mechanics, men like the legendary Grease Monkeys of the 4th Armored Division, and gave them an order that was technically a violation of Army regulations. He told them to stop waiting for a better tank to be shipped from Detroit. He told them to build one themselves, using the bones of the enemy. The scene in the repair depots behind the front lines was something out of a chaotic industrial fever dream. While the rest of the Army followed the manual, Patton's mechanics were scavenging. They moved through tank graveyards, using oxyacetylene torches to cut the thick, high-quality armor plating off captured German Panthers and destroyed Shermans. The plan was simple, brutal, and entirely unauthorized. Weld these massive slabs of salvaged steel directly onto the front glacis and turret mantlets of the active Shermans. They called it expedient armor, but to the men inside, it was a lifeline. They weren't just adding steel, they were adding hope. As the sun began to set over the French countryside, the first of these modified monsters were being prepped for the line. They were heavy, they were ugly, and they smelled of fresh welds and scorched paint. But as Sergeant Miller looked at the extra 3 inches of German steel now protecting his chest, he felt something he hadn't felt since landing at Omaha Beach. Chance. But the real test wasn't in the shop, it was in the mud. And the Germans were about to find out that their invincible 80mm guns were suddenly hitting a wall they couldn't break. The transformation of the Third Army's motor pools into high-stakes fabrication shops was a sight to behold. Under the flickering glow of welding torches, the air vibrating with the scream of grinders against hardened steel, the Patton Special was born. It was a race against time. Every hour a tank spent in the shop was an hour it wasn't on the line, but every tank that went to the line without this illegal skin was a rolling coffin. The mechanics worked in shifts, fueled by black coffee and the desperate pleas of the tankers who brought them crates of cognac and liberated German Lugers just to move their vehicle to the front of the welding line. You can almost feel the heat radiating off the hull as the heavy slabs of salvaged Panther armor are lowered into place. This wasn't precision engineering, it was battlefield surgery. The welds were thick, ugly, and hurried. In some cases, the mechanics didn't just stop at steel. They built iron cages on the front of the tanks and filled them with sandbags, or even poured a layer of concrete between 2 sheets of metal. It was a desperate, Frankenstein-like attempt to defeat the physics of German high-velocity rounds. Washington was furious. Reports began to filter back to the states about unauthorized weight increases and impending mechanical failure. High-ranking officials in the Ordnance Department sent frantic cables warning that the additional 5 to 10 tons of scrap metal would blow the engines and snap the suspension systems. Patton, in typical fashion, ignored them. He knew that a broken-down tank could be towed and fixed, but a tank hit by an 80-millimeter round left nothing to repair. September 19, 1944, 09:40 a.m., near Ericourt, France. The morning mist is a thick gray blanket clinging to the rolling hills of Lorraine. For the Germans, this was supposed to be the moment they drove the Americans back to the sea. They had assembled a massive counteroffensive involving the 5th Panzer Army, equipped with the newest Panther tanks. These were the kings of the battlefield, capable of picking off Shermans from 2,000 yards away. Inside a modified M4A3 Sherman, Lieutenant Bucky Walters peers through his periscope. His tank, nicknamed Blockbuster, is one of the jumbos in all but name. It's carrying an extra 4 inches of scrap steel on its nose. He sees a shape emerge from the fog, the unmistakable jagged silhouette of a Panther. "Target! Tank! 12 o'clock!" Bucky yells, his voice cracking with adrenaline. The Panther fires first. It's a textbook shot. The German gunner is an expert, and the 75mm KWK-42 round, a projectile designed specifically to punch through Allied armor, screams across the field at 3,000 feet per second. In any other engagement, in any other month of the war, this would be the end of the story. The round would hit the Sherman's front plate, enter the fighting compartment, and turn the crew into a memory. The impact sounds like a cathedral bell being struck by a sledgehammer. The entire 30-ton Sherman is rocked backward, its tracks digging into the soft French soil. Inside, the crew is blinded by a shower of internal paint flakes and dust. Their ears are ringing, their hearts hammering against their ribs. "Are we hit? Are we on fire?" the driver screams. Bucky blinks, looking at the gauges. There's no smoke. There's no smell of burning fuel. He looks through the periscope again. The Panther is reloading, its commander visibly stunned, leaning out of his hatch to see why the American tank is still standing. The illegal German steel welded to the Sherman's front had acted as a sacrificial layer. The enemy round had shattered against the salvaged plate. Its energy dissipated before it could reach the Sherman's original skin. "Driver, forward! Gunner, heat! Fire!" The Sherman roars to life, its engine straining under the massive weight of its forbidden armor, but it moves. It closes the distance, and at 700 yards, Bucky's gunner puts a round through the Panther's turret ring. The German tank erupts in a fountain of sparks and oily black smoke. This wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a psychological revolution. Word spread like wildfire through the Third Army. The armor works. The jumbos and the expedient Shermans began to lead every column. They became the point men of Patton's armored spearheads. The Germans, who had spent years mocking the soft American tanks, suddenly found themselves facing a foe that refused to die. But as the Third Army pushed deeper into the heart of the Reich, the weight of the illegal armor began to take a toll that even Patton couldn't ignore. The mud was getting deeper, the hills steeper, and the engines were screaming in protest. The armor war was about to enter its most brutal phase yet, and the illegal Shermans were about to face their greatest test in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. By December 1944, the illegal Shermans had become the legendary workhorses of Patton's Third Army, but the weather was turning into a deadlier foe than the German 88s. The temperature plummeted, and the French countryside was swallowed by a relentless, bone-chilling fog. This was the prelude to the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. When Hitler launched his desperate final gamble through the Ardennes forest, he counted on two things: the Allied air forces being grounded by the weather and his heavy panzers crushing the flimsy American lines. But Hitler hadn't accounted for the bastard Shermans. As the German spearheads shattered the thin American lines in the north, Patton received the order that would define his legacy. turn his entire army north, and relieve the besieged 101st Airborne at Bastogne. It was a 100-mile race through a frozen hellscape. The illegal Shermans, now laden with up to 10 tons of extra steel, sandbags, and timber, were reaching their breaking point. You can almost hear the agonizing groan of the 4 GAA engines as they fought to pull the extra weight through knee-deep slush and over black ice. December 26, 1944, 04:45 p.m., outside Bastogne, Belgium. The 4th Armored Division was the tip of Patton's spear. At the head of the column sat the Jumbos and the field-modified M4s. They were hideous to look at, caked in frozen mud, their illegal welds hidden under layers of whitewash camouflage. Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding a Sherman named Cobra King, stared through the frost-rimmed glass of his vision port. Ahead lay the village of Assenois, the last German stronghold blocking the path to the battered bastards of Bastogne. The German defense was a nightmare of anti-tank guns and entrenched infantry. As Cobra King crested the final ridge, the German gunners opened up. This was the moment the Ordnance Department back in Washington had warned about. The extra weight had made the tanks slower, less nimble, and more likely to throw a track in the treacherous snow. But Boggess didn't slow down. He knew that the mobility the bureaucrats loved wouldn't save the men trapped in Bastogne. Only unstoppable force would. A German 75mm anti-tank round slammed into the front of Cobra King. The impact was so violent it knocked the wind out of Boggess. But the illegal sandwich of steel and sandbags held. The round ricocheted off the modified glacis plate, screaming into the gray sky like a wounded animal. Cobra King kept rolling. It didn't just survive. It became a psychological battering ram. The German soldiers, seeing a Sherman take a direct hit and keep coming, began to panic. They had been told the American tanks were Tommy cookers, but this beast seemed possessed. Boggess drove his 38-ton monster straight through the German lines, the extra armor shrugging off small arms fire and shrapnel as if it were rain. At 4:50 p.m., Cobra King broke through the final perimeter. Boggess looked out his hatch and saw a ragged, freezing paratrooper from the 101st. "How are you guys doing?" Boggess asked casually. "We're doing fine," the paratrooper replied. "What took you so long?" The relief of Bastogne was a triumph of Patton's will, but it was physically made possible by the illegal modifications. These tanks had done what the standard M4 never could. They had survived the initial, lethal contact of a breakthrough. However, as the war pushed into the spring of 1945, a new threat emerged. The Germans were no longer just defending with tanks. They were handing out Panzerfausts, handheld shape-charge rockets, to every teenager and old man in the Volkssturm. These weapons could melt through even the thickest illegal armor. To survive the final miles to Berlin, Patton's mechanics would have to innovate one last time, using a material so unmilitary that it nearly caused a mutiny in the high command. As the snows of the Ardennes melted into the treacherous mud of early 1945, the nature of the war changed again. The Third Army was no longer just fighting panzer divisions in open fields. They were entering the death zones of German cities. Every window, every basement, and every pile of rubble now hid a Panzerfaust, a cheap, mass-produced rocket that utilized a shaped charge warhead. Unlike the solid steel shots of the Tigers 88, these rockets didn't try to punch through armor. They used a jet of molten copper to burn through it. The illegal steel plates that had saved the crews from tank shells were suddenly vulnerable to a weapon carried by a 15-year-old boy in a Hitler Youth uniform. Patton's mechanics realized that to stop a shaped charge, they didn't just need thickness. They needed spaced protection to disrupt the jet before it hit the hull. The solution was as unmilitary as it gets. You can almost see the confusion on the faces of the supply officers as Patton's crews began liberating massive amounts of Portland cement, chicken wire, and lumber from German construction yards. March 14, 1945, 10:15 a.m., near the Rhine River. The tank crews of the 14th Armored Division were looking at their vehicles with a mix of pride and disbelief. They had built wooden cofferdams around their turrets and glacis plates, then poured wet concrete 6 inches thick into the gaps. Others had welded bed springs and heavy wire mesh inches away from the hull. To the West Point purists back in the States, Patton's army now looked like a traveling scrap heap. General Eisenhower's staff were horrified. They argued that the concrete was useless against high-velocity rounds and, worse, it made the tanks so heavy they were sinking into the soft German soil. But Patton had seen the data. He knew that while the concrete might crack under a shell, it caused the Panzerfaust rockets to detonate prematurely, dissipating the deadly molten jet into the air instead of the crew compartment. Inside one of these concrete Shermans, Corporal Gene Henderson felt the tank lurch as it entered a narrow street in a nameless German town. Suddenly, a flash erupted from a cellar window. A Panzerfaust rocket screamed across the 10-foot gap and slammed into the side of the turret. The sound was a dull, wet thud, followed by a hiss. In a standard Sherman, the crew would have been dead in seconds, but Henderson felt only a slight vibration. He looked out the periscope to see a massive crater in the concrete illegal armor. The concrete had shattered, absorbing the thermal energy and breaking the focus of the copper jet. The steel hull underneath was barely scorched. "Gunner, traverse left. Blast that cellar," Henderson roared. By the time Patton reached the Rhine, his expedient tanks had become the stuff of legend. The truth was finally undeniable. The amateur field modifications had outperformed the professional designs of the Ordnance Department. When the war finally ended in May 1945, a survey of Third Army tankers revealed a chilling statistic. Those in the illegal modified tanks had a significantly higher survival rate than those in factory-standard vehicles. Patton had defied the Pentagon, ignored the engineers, and risked his career on a scrap metal theory. But as he stood on the banks of the Rhine, watching his iron coffins turn into Iron Kings, he knew he had won more than just a battle. He had won the loyalty of the men who lived because he chose to look the other way while they broke the rules. The M4 Sherman was never the best tank of World War II, but in the hands of Patton's mechanics, it became a testament to American ingenuity, a machine that refused to stay within its limits, modified by the illegal genius of men who simply refused to die.